Hello and welcome to video 2 of the Figuring Out Fabris series. My name is Stephen Farah, known in the SCA as the Honorable Lord Esteban de la Boca of Glen Albin. And I'd like to start this video with my thoughts and corrections to video 1, because after publishing the video, I received a lot of wonderful feedback from you guys, and I wanted to talk about that feedback and talk about how my thought process on this video series has sort of changed. The first thing I want to talk about is why I'm going through the manual in its direct order. I'm trying to, especially in these early chapters, not use any concepts that are in later on chapters. However, this can become difficult, especially when, say, Fabris teaches postures before teaching finding the blade, or when Fabris teaches, counter postures without voids. It becomes a little bit difficult to kind of stick to the material. But the reason I'm doing this is I feel that Fabris introduced these concepts in an order of importance, and this was either for ease of instruction within his school, or it was an order of importance when you look at an action in the plates. I'm leaning more towards it's because of how he taught things in his school. It's easier to teach a newcomer a position of the body and that they move forward rather than to try to teach them footwork or voids or anything of that more complicated nature. But I'm just curious on this myself, and am looking forward to seeing, what insight I may gain from doing this in order. So far, in video 1, I feel the major points Fabris were trying to make were: you should try to make every effort to approach your opponent safely, being sure to consider their posture and to counter it during your approach. I feel like this is mentioned many times in the chapters, and that he really goes into how difficult it is to move into the misura larga and the misura straighta, how you need to somehow trick your opponent or move their guard out of position as you perform these movements, and he demonstrates how to do this later on. So I think that this is going to be a major idea of Fabris, is that safe and non-stop approach. The next thing was that an attack in contratempo, or during an opponent's movement, is superior. He mentions moving during an opponent's tempo multiple times throughout the chapters, and it feels like this is kind of the main idea that he's setting up, right? The idea of everything in contratempo is superior because anything that takes less tempo is superior. And then he goes into that in great detail, talking about how the thrust is superior to any other action because you can evaluate any action by the number of tempos it takes to execute in kind of a risk-reward system. In terms of corrections to video 1, I would like to clarify that book 1 is in 2 parts. The second part deals with secondary weapons, and I mistakenly said that book 1 was only single sword. I should have said primarily single sword. That's my mistake. I also said that you probably would not want to move more than 2 hand positions at a time. For example, rolling from 4th guard to 1st guard is often done incorrectly because the movement of the arm is made too big and over-exaggerated. And so from a beginner's perspective, you would want to perhaps split that into different rolls of the hand as you move forward in an action. But you absolutely should get this skill because it is going to be used throughout the manual to roll from 4th into 1st and 1st into 4th. So when you practice this movement, just try to make sure that the circle that your hand will naturally form as it rolls would only just go around an opponent's guard. If you're moving your shoulder at all while you do this roll, you're probably making it a bit too large. The last thing I want to talk about is Fabris' second hand position. We're going to go over this today, so I just wanted to mention briefly that Fabris' second hand guard had the point below the opponent's blade, not above, and hopefully I can demonstrate that a lot better today. So before we move on to the next chapters, I wanted to review some of the main ideas from chapters 1 through 6, because these chapters focus primarily on how Fabris would approach an opponent in an engagement. Fabris first would be sure that he moves his sword, then hand, then arm, then body, then feet when he moves. And this is because the sword moves a little bit faster than the arm, which moves a little bit faster than the body, which moves a little bit faster than the feet. And so the kind of consequence of this is that as you lunge, you need to be sure to fully extend your sword and your arm before you have that slight lean forward with your body and continue your lunge onto your feet. Fabris also talked about moving from out of fighting distance into this sort of out of measure distance. Because when you're in out of measure, you're just out of the place where your opponent can hit you. So you want to make sure that as you enter, you form a counter posture. And we're going to be looking at a lot of different postures and counter postures as we move through Fabris's plates. But the biggest takeaways here were, one, a posture is not a fixed position. You're going to be transferring between postures throughout the course of a fight, which is something you see very little overall in the SCA, at least. Many people take a static guard and kind of don't move out of that until they're attacking, whereas Fabris was very fluid in his movement as he fought. The counter posture needs to begin by first pointing just over your opponent's guard at the thing that scares you, and then if their blade is to your outside, which is your sword hip, you're going to move into a second hand position, or if it's on the inside towards your chest and offhand, you're going to roll to that fourth hand position. When you reach that counter posture, your blade should be positioned so that as you move forward, the strong of your blade must be in a position of dominance over the weak of theirs. Fabris divided the blade into 4 sections, the strongest being near your hilt and the weakest being near your sword. And you want to make sure that more of your strong is over their weak, meaning more of your sword is going to kind of meet theirs if they ever hit an intersection. Even though Fabris liked to avoid blade contact, he prepared for it. Now, once a counter posture is formed, you can begin your attack by moving into the misura larga, which was a lunging distance, meaning that after you fully extend your blade in your arm and you lunge, you can hit your opponent. Moving into the misura larga and any other measure is going to be a dangerous action. So Fabris would recommend performing a feint or some other movement as you move forward so that you move your opponent out of their posture as you move into your counter posture. A lot of what Fabris does is this sort of moving your opponent out of what makes them comfortable and then moving into a position of superiority. As you step forward, you're going to make sure that you're moving your front foot first and you're kind of pushing from your back foot and then moving your back foot back into position. You're not really stepping so much as pushing yourself forward, and there are a lot of resources on fencing footwork that are available to kind of help you maintain your balance and your footwork, but the shorter you can make this movement, the more safe you're going to be. So I find that when I move forward in fencing, I try to move forward about half of my foot's length at a time so that I'm always in a position where I can change my posture. Once you arrive in the misura larga, if your opponent moves their blade, meaning they kind of disengage around you or try to form some sort of gain on your blade or anything of that matter, but they don't move their body, meaning they haven't created any sort of change of measure, then you're going to form a new counter posture to their blade position, and then you're going to move into the misura straighta by stepping forward again. This is rare in my opinion. I don't very often fence people who just move their blade without positioning their body in some way, but these are the sorts of things to look for because Fabris has a system of fencing that relies very strongly on moving during your opponent's movements. So practicing for every opportunity is definitely going to be useful as we move on. So as they disengage around your blade or move their blade in some way, you're going to counter where their blade will be by moving into the counter posture and then moving into the misura straighta by stepping forward again. From here, if you've maintained your counter posture and your opponent hasn't moved their body, you should be able to just lean forward and hit. But if your opponent disrupts your counter posture in a way that puts you in danger, you're going to then move past your opponent. As you move past, you're going to raise your guard up to sort of protect you from a cut as you move and step past their body. The reason for this is often when you're in the Missouri Strata and someone takes control of your blade, they usually aren't able to hit you unless you give them the extra tempo, and you're not able to hit them either, so it's best just to move past your opponent. If you try to move backwards or straight to the side, you're just going to give your opponent an opportunity to hit you, so you move past your opponent in the straight line, and then as you move past them quickly, you reset and prepare for another engagement. Continuing on main ideas from chapters 1 through 6, as your opponent moves, your primary goal is to hit them in contra-tempo as they perform their action, or to steal time by moving into one of the two distances with a superior counter posture as your opponent moves towards you and then hitting them. For example, if your opponent is moving into the out of measure distance in order to move into misura larga, you could then predict where they'll step and where their blade will be, counter posture, and then step forward at about the same time. This puts you in a superior position, you'll have control over their sword, and you'll be in the misura larga because they've taken care of half of the movement for you. This is a huge part of many masters fencing techniques, but especially Fabris's, as he constantly is trying to get people to give you free time to hit them. If your opponent ever moves in a way that doesn't remove the advantage of your counter posture or move them to a different distance, then you should hit them immediately as they take their tempo. For example, if you're in the misura larga and your opponent begins to move without taking themselves out of measure or changing their blade, you should just hit them. You have superior position. If you're misura larga, you lunge to hit, and if you're in the misura strata, you're going to just lean forward to hit. So now let's move on to Chapter 7 on cuts, on their number, natures, and uses, on which of them is better, and whether it is preferable to cut or to thrust. And Fabris talks a bit about cuts, and he says that there are 4 principal cuts, which is a mandrito, reverso, sottomano, and montante. These are cuts that either move from the right side downwards or left side downwards, or right side upwards and left side upwards. Fabris then describes the different types of cuts that he generally experiences and the strengths and weaknesses of all of them. Fabris overall doesn't seem to be a huge fan of cuts because they're going to take more time than a thrust. However, he does take the time to say that some cuts are better than others. For example, if you deliver a cut from the shoulder, this is going to make a wide arc, which takes too much time and leaves you too vulnerable to the opponent's attack. But if you deliver that same cut from the elbow, while you still make a wide arc, you're making a smaller one, which means your cut takes less time. You lose a little bit of power, but you don't create such a large opening, which is arguably more important. But even better, you can deliver a cut from the wrist, which makes an even smaller movement. It allows your arm to remain extended and motionless, and it makes it harder for the opponent to take advantage of this opening because it's much smaller. The cut also ends with the point of the sword directed at the opponent, so if he tries to respond in contra-tempo, a lot of the time you've already created a superior posture, and you can just go ahead and hit him as he tries to attack you. The last way to attack with a cut is to kind of cut from the shoulder but with an extended, stiffened arm. This is going to be better than the shoulder or elbow cut because it is going to take less time, but in power, it's going to be better than the wrist. You just kind of let your arm fall down and intercept an opponent as they strike. Fabris says, in all respects, thrusting is more advantageous and deadlier than cutting. With a thrust, it is easier to strike quicker and from further away and to recover afterwards. However, Fabris also says that if you're facing an armored opponent or multiple opponents at once, you might just use that cut because you can really beat their blades out of position, and with one blow you can intercept many blades at one time. So now we can start to demonstrate some of the cuts that Fabris has described, starting with the mandrito and reverso shoulder cut, mandrito falling from the right side and reverso falling from the left. And immediately you should be able to notice just how large this cut is. I can almost imagine thrusting and hitting someone and intercepting this cut. And it's no smaller in the rising cuts either, the Sottomano and Montante, again rising from the right and then left side. This is a huge action, and while it's very powerful, especially if you're standing still, it's just not going to be very useful. The shoulder cuts are large, but the elbow cuts are also going to give somewhat of an opening. Your Mandrito and Reverso are large, and your Sottomano and Montante are not going to be much smaller. You can see that this still creates a large opening. You have to bring your sword well offline to begin the cut, and by the time you finish, you've probably already gotten thrust. The wrist cut is going to be a lot smaller. You can already see that this is already covering a lot more area. Your opponent has to go all the way through your sword and your arm as you complete this cut. While it does lose a lot of power from the previous cuts, it is a great way to wound your opponent if you are able to perform this quick action. The stiff shoulder cut is fairly similar in regards to the target that it covers. However, it does get a little bit more power at the expense of a little bit more time. Again, you can see that the sword is in front of the body for the falling cuts, the Mandrito and Reverso, and it's still in front of the body for the rising cuts, the Sottomano and Montante. So cuts are not without their uses. So what does this look like in an actual fight? What would you be trying to do with a cut in this context? Well, you would be aiming for usually the wrist or the forearm, or perhaps you're going for a beat attack. And it's important to realize that this whole time that you're rising your sword out of position, you are creating a rather large opening for your opponent, which you can exploit. As you step forward, you move your sword blade upwards after perhaps a feint. Your opponent goes for your body, thrusting at this nice open target that's been created. You complete the cut, intercepting their blade and stopping their attack. And while you do that, your sword is online. Maybe you stop their sword, maybe you've cut their wrist or their forearm, but because your point is online, you can continue your attack with a thrust towards their body. Again, you're able to bring that cut down and intercept their cut. You can do this from the other side as well, revealing your entire outside, and then as they move for that attack, you complete the cut, intercepting their blade or arm, and you continue with the thrust. Now here we can see a cut being used against an opponent. As I step forward, I'm going to do some sort of movement to bring my opponent out of their guard. So as my point starts towards their inside, I'm going to move towards the outside. I'm causing them to gain more towards the outside. Then as I continue forward, I'm going to bring my blade offline for the cut. This is going to create a large opening for my opponent to strike, which I plan on them using. As they respond to the invitation and go to hit, I intercept their blade with a cut while being sure to step offline so that I remove my body from where my opponent was targeting. As I beat their blade aside, I can then continue my movement forward and continue with a thrust. Now again, the same movement. I bring my opponent's blade offline. I step forward, bring my blade offline. They continue for the thrust. I intercept with a cut and then bring my blade back online to my opponent. You could do this from either direction. You could also step further offline with a lunge to cut at the wrist or the arm without having to continue for a thrust, but using this invitation with the cut can be quite effective. In the next chapter, Fabris talks on the advantages and drawbacks of parrying, on those who parry using the left hand and sword alone. And in the text, Fabris states, "If you examine the parry, you will find it to be a form of fear, because if you were not afraid of harm, you would not see the need to defend. This type of defense can therefore be dubbed obedience, even servitude, all the more when it is performed out of necessity. If you can put your opponent under this necessity to parry, you will be at a great advantage. As he goes to parry, he creates an opening where he can be wounded, thus rendering his defense ineffectual." So Fabris in this chapter kind of discusses the importance of voids. To void is to bring your body away from your opponent's attack. by a complete change of your body position. So if your opponent was directing a thrust towards your chest, you would use some form of motion to move that chest target completely out of the way of your sword. And Fabris says that doing this is much better than only parrying. And this is because when you go to parry, you're moving your sword in response to your opponent, which means that your opponent is controlling what you do. For example, if I were to attack you to your outside and you were to parry outside in a second-hand position, as you do that, I could quickly disengage and continue that thrust on towards your chest. Fabris says that it is better to let cuts fall past you and void away from thrust than to parry, because the attack that you move to parry brings you out of your counter posture, which opens you up completely if the oncoming attack is a feint. With sword and dagger, you can parry with the dagger and counter with the sword, but in sword alone it becomes much more important to void. If you must parry a cut, place your strong in the spot where their sword will fall, and at the same time deliver a quick thrust so that your point will make it to your opponent's body before their blade connects with your strong. Fabris talks about kind of putting your sword in the position where your opponent's blade will be. This isn't quite the same as I parry because it is in anticipation to your opponent's action rather than a response to your opponent's action, which means you're still trying to set your opponent up for something, thereby controlling the fight. If you cannot strike your opponent, generally they cannot strike you. If you're unsure when they attack, counter posture as you lean back to give your body more distance. You never want to parry if you cannot counter or at least simulate an attack. So if you must parry for some reason, you need to make sure that you're able to counter immediately. For example, if your opponent is flinging their sword and you know that you'll have ample opportunity, you could parry and void at the same time, and setting your blade up to where you can counterattack as well. Fabris then states again that cuts are slow and that often you can wound your opponent with a thrust and then step back into safety before they finish bringing their blade completely offline and then back down for a cut. If you're going to defend against a thrust, first, don't parry. The biggest concern with a thrust is that your opponent can make quick mutations with their point, so as you move to parry, they can just move their point away from your sword and continue their attack. If you do parry, you should do so with a void of the body while keeping your sword online so that you finish the void in a counter posture suitable for an immediate counter attack. Fabris also states that he does not consider grabbing the blade with an offhand a valid technique if your opponent has a sharp sword. Instead, you should just have your hand ready near the strong of your sword so that you can aid in defense. Place your hand to block the most likely opening if your opponent disengages around your blade during your attack. So for example, if I attack in a high second, I'm going to place my hand below my sword towards that low line to block a possible disengage. To counter someone who's defending with their offhand, you could consider approaching with a counter posture that has a sword at an angle, and then quickly straighten the sword out as you attack so that you move directly above or below the hand, and now the hand has to intercept a point rather than the entire line of your sword. Fabris then speaks on people that have their hand extended. Oftentimes you see this as a guard with the sword hilt near the hip and the hand kind of out in front, outstretched with no secondary. And Fabris basically says, don't do this. You have a huge opening because your hand can't effectively defend against the sword. It takes too long and the sword tip can permutate very, very quickly. And you have to completely extend your sword in order to counterattack, and there's no way that you can intercept their blade in time if you have to extend, even if you're in a counter posture. So Fabris overall says don't use your offhand outstretched in front of you to try to knock the sword out of the way. You should always use your sword as a primary defense, never your hand. And as a general rule, only use the hand if you can reach the opponent's hilt, kind of like a Spanish moment of conclusion. If you are going to reach your offhand out in front of you, it should only be to grab the opponent's hilt so that you're able to appropriately disarm them. So now let's talk about voids with Fabris. So here you can see that as I come towards my opponent, I gain their blade. I have my strong over their weak, but I also have a huge target for them ready to go, right? So the idea is that I'm inviting them to disengage around my blade and strike at my body. If they don't move at all, I can just extend, lunge, and hit. But if they do disengage, I need to move my body out of the place that their sword will be while keeping my blade in a position of strength. So I'm going to then pass with my other foot and strike my opponent, keeping my blade out in front of me, moving my body all the way out of the way, and being able to completely void that opponent's shot. Again, in the other direction, I've gained their blade to this side. If they do try to strike this hip, I've already got a position of strength. They're more than likely going to aim at this large open target. As they do, I'm going to step away from that area, strike my opponent, and then recover again. Exposing, striking. As a drill, this also works very well. You're going to come forward and gain your opponent's blade, making sure that you have that intersection of strong versus weak. Here I'd argue that I should be a little bit further down their blade in order to make this disengage even better. As they disengage to strike, I'm going to move my front foot in the opposite direction, making sure that I have my open hand covering the most likely angle of attack. And as I step forward, I'm going to completely extend my arm, striking as they hit. Again, as I come forward, I'm going to gain the blade. Here, I like this gain a lot better. It's a lot nicer of an intersection. This is going to increase the length of his disengage. As he disengages, he's going to lunge to hit. Notice that I have my offhand ready to go to guard the most likely area of attack. So if I were to attack from here, this hand would stay protecting this low line and perhaps even move underneath the arm. As he disengages to hit, I'm going to protect the most likely line of attack, step offline to hit, and make sure that I continue on to my target. I can even do this from the opposite direction. As I gain in a fourth hand position, having a nice intersection with my opponent and guarding my face. As he disengages around, I'm going to bring my point below his sword, just like Fabris' second, and I'm going to go ahead and continue my shot while using my front foot to step offline and continuing into his body. Again, I gain in a fourth hand position here. My gain is a little bit too deep. I should have had a much better intersection with this much forward. I should have been about here. As he disengages, I'm going to roll my hand completely around, moving the tip below his guard and getting this very nice target down below his body. Another thing that's important to consider is where your point is when you initially gain your opponent's blade. Ryan's point here is directly over my hilt and a little bit off. It's because as you rotate to the next guard, this point is effectively going to form a cone of defense as it completely goes to the other side. So here, as I disengage, he's going to sweep his point over as well, completely covering that area. And you can see that it completely, because he's angled it, covers that line and blocks me from continuing my attack. Again, as he has this point over my guard on this side, as I go to disengage, he's going to completely swing it around, intercepting my sword and striking as he goes forward. So you can kind of pre-plan where you want your sword to go by moving that tip to where you most want to sweep that point around to intercept your opponent's blade, which is very important when you void. You should be ending in a counter posture able to hit your opponent. So now let's talk about our final chapter for today. What is finding the sword and how it is affected when a sword is understood to be found. So far we've talked about postures and counter postures, voids, cuts, thrusting. So we're going to talk about something now that many would consider to be absolutely essential to Italian rapier, which is finding the sword. Finding the sword is similar to counter posture, with the main difference being that it is possible to find your opponent's sword without covering the exact line between his point and your body. You still have an advantage because they cannot wound you without passing through your strong, which will be so close to their point that you've effectively found it in the middle of their lunge from misura larga or lean from misura straighta. In a counter posture, the line is completely closed. When the sword is found, you have gained the blade with an advantage of strong over weak and could easily close the line completely if they attack. I use the point of the thing that scares you technique. Generally, if you have your tips slightly intercepting over your opponent's blade and pointing towards the opposite end of their guard, then you're going to have found their blade by a slight margin. The sword is always stronger on the side to which it points. Don't point past your opponent's profile or they can turn this technique against you. And by that, I mean your point should be still directed towards their body, not out in empty space on either side of them. Now Fabris then describes, well, now that I've found the sword, what attacks do I do from there? And he talks about his fourth hand and second hand position attack, which I've already demonstrated in the void section, but I want to review it again. To attack in fourth, after you've pointed over your opponent's blade from the inside line, move your point towards your opponent while moving your hilt into a fourth hand position from third into a spot where your point used to be, or as close to it as possible. Generally, the more that you angulate your guard, the stronger your attack going in is going to be. However, if you haven't found their blade correctly, if you angulate your guard a good amount, you're just going to be playing into their hands as you're increasing the amount of strength that they have over your sword. To attack in second, after you've pointed over an opponent's blade from your outside line, you're going to move your point under their blade and towards your opponent while you roll your guard from third to second into the space where your point used to be. So here's a drill that you can use to practice gaining the blade and finding the sword. So here you can see that Ryan has properly gained my blade. He's pointing his blade over mine and he has a position of strong over weak. Remember that Fabris divides the sword into 4 sections, 1 being the strongest by the hand, 4 being the weakest by the tip, and you want to have at least 1 section over. Here he has an intersection of about 3 to 1. In an ideal world, he would have 2 to 1 being a little further up the blade or a little further back on his. But as you can see, no matter how hard I try to push against his blade, even when I roll into fourth hand position, even when I use 2 hands, he has complete control over the sword. Now again, I can do the same thing to him. He can push as much as he wants, but he cannot really gain a power over my blade. So now for the next part of this drill, it is pretty simple. Simply point over the thing that scares you, and then as you do this, your opponent should continue to attack on that same line. They should find that they intercept your strong as they come forward. You may only need to slightly adjust your guard. So here I've pointed over Ryan's blade. Ryan goes forward trying to attack, but he cannot reach my body. It moves right past my chest because I've already pointed over his blade and he ends up intercepting my strong. And by this, I've found the blade without even using a hand position. Again, I just point over the blade to the outside, and as he goes forward, he cannot possibly hit me, even with just a slight adjustment to the blade. Now, for the next part of this drill, have your opponent go on any posture that they want and simply find their sword. You want to think about where their blade will go when they attack, and you want to point over the thing that scares you. So here, he's to his outside. It's pretty obvious that he's going to attack towards my inside line. I find his blade by pointing over it. I consider where it's going to be, and now as he completes his attack, he's able to just go forward, and he will completely miss because I've already found his blade. He takes another posture, and we can do the same thing. Now, even if they're swinging their blade back on line, you can predict where it's going to go. His blade has to go in front of him. He's not going to twirl here and try to attack to the other side. He's going to completely swing it around, so I just need to place my blade at a point where his sword will be, thus finding it. So as he comes forward, it will completely connect with my sword, and with a slight adjustment, it will be intercepted. Some people call this a virtual gaining of the blade. but at the end of the day, it's all finding the sword. So now let's look at Fabris's second hand position. I have an opponent on guard. I go to find his blade. Before I go into the out of measure distance, I step forward into Missouri Larga, and once I'm there, I'm going to lower my point below his guard and raise my hilt up to where my point is. So it should be at this line here. This is a little high to do this technique, but it still works. As I raise my hilt up, I just extend forward into a nice forward lunge. You can see my knee ends directly lined up with my toe, and I can lean forward and hit my opponent. Again, I step forward, gaining my opponent's blade and going into the Missouri Larga, and then I just lower my point below his sword, bring my hilt to where it is, and hit that nice target directly underneath his sword arm. For Fabris's fourth hand attack, you're going to do the same thing, pointing over your opponent's blade towards the outside, approaching, blocking them from hitting your inside line, and then where my tip is here, I'm going to raise my hilt up to that point as I lunge to hit. You can see that it creates that straight line, and as I come forward, it connects with my opponent. Again, I move forward, gaining my opponent's blade, and as I extend, you can see my hilt raises up to where my point once was, and I can attack my opponent even with their offhand guarding the most likely target. Now, the more you push this hand out as you attack, you're able to create more of an angulation of strength and really glide past your opponent. So as he steps forward, he really pumps that arm towards his outer shoulder, completely closing that line of counterattack. You can see it really brings my sword off at this angle, really ensuring that he's completely safe as he comes forward. And that brings us to the end of this video. So we just finished covering chapters 7 through 9 in Fabris's text. So let's review some of the main points. Number 1, find your opponent's sword, both as you posture and counter posture. I believe Fabris was trying to teach these concepts in an order of ease. So we know that a posture and a counter posture puts our sword between us and our opponent and protects us, walling us off from their attack. Finding the sword is a little bit more subtle. You're able to just kind of place your sword where your opponent's sword will go, avoiding that blade contact, but completely walling off their best line of attack. If you're going to attack your opponent, attack with a thrust, not a cut unless you're facing multiple opponents. All cuts are going to be slower than thrusts because you have to spend at least 2 tempi moving your point offline and then back on. So whether it's a wrist cut or even that fully stiffened arm cut, you're still going to want to thrust instead. And then finally, don't parry, void. If you're going to parry an opponent's shot, you're most likely going to be falling into a trap. If my opponent tries to attack me to my outside and I move to parry, he can quickly disengage and hit me by continuing his attack to the inside. However, that's not to say that you cannot find the sword preemptively. If I can predict my opponent's actions, I can place my posture or counter posture in a way that I can intercept it. And that's not quite the same as parrying because I'm predicting my opponent's action, not responding to it. In the next video, we're going to go over some of the more advanced concepts of Fabris, contratempo, invitations, and some of the more fun stuff that we're going to be working through with every plate. Again, we're just kind of reviewing major points that we're going to apply to each of the plates. We're not quite to the Fabris postures yet, but we will be there eventually. But that is it for this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.